My name is Fiona David. I'm the Research Chair with the Minderoo Foundation, and I'm delighted to be here today at the University of Western Australia Forest Hall with Neill Wilkins from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Neill, we've had a fantastic talk from you today about the role of business in preventing modern slavery. But first, let's get some terminology clear. What do we mean when we use this term modern day slavery?
Well, modern slavery is perhaps better called forced labour and trafficking. That would be the correct term for it. However, modern slavery seems to be the term that everyone is using these days, and the reason being clear, it's perhaps easier to understand. The trouble with the term modern slavery, however, is that perhaps it makes us start looking for the wrong things, that we're starting to look for slaves when we actually ought to be looking at what's going on for workers.
We've seen growth in legislation like the Modern Slavery Act in England, where you're primarily based. In Australia, we're looking at some sort of introduction of a Modern Slavery Act here as well. Are there some lessons that you have learnt from what has worked or what hasn't worked with the Modern Slavery Act in the United Kingdom?
We think that the Modern Slavery Act in the United Kingdom has been a really significant driver of change. In particular, the fact that the companies now have to produce a modern slavery statement, and that needs to be annual, so we're hoping to see improvement over time. Also, what's significant is the fact that it needs to be signed off at executive level, so a board member needs to sign off and take responsibility for the modern slavery statement. We think that this has helped ensure that improvement in practice is integrated much deeper and more properly into company operations. Things that we think are lacking from the British Act that we hope Australia will learn from is that there's no register of companies in the UK, of companies that are supposed to report under the terms of the Act, and we know that many of them currently are not doing. Another significant failing was not to include public procurement in the British Act.
I was fascinated to hear you talking today about the role that business played in getting modern slavery legislation through in the UK. So in your experience, was business for or against the introduction of this supply chain transparency legislation?
I think that responsible business has absolutely nothing to fear from transparency legislation like the Modern Slavery Act. What we found was that decent companies, many of them were doing good work anyway, but then being undercut by companies for whom ethics weren't a consideration. What the Modern Slavery Act and the reporting requirement have done is hopefully started to provide a level playing field so that all companies are competing fairly within the law.
One of the issues that you work on a lot with the Institute of Human Rights and Business is protecting the rights of migrant workers. I was very interested today to hear you talk about how recruiters and agents, third-party agents, can often be the first step on a longer road towards exploitation. Can you give me a sense of how does recruitment fees come into the employment process for migrant workers, and how does that lead to exploitation?
Well, many migrant workers, it's absolutely the first part of an exploitative process. So the common business model in much of the global south and in other countries is that migrant workers will pay a recruitment fee to secure employment abroad. That fee will cover many different charges, but the workers are still paying that charge. Now, to afford those fees, many workers will take out a loan, often at usurious rates of interest, and find themselves in situations of debt bondage. So companies perhaps undertaking good work in their supply chains, making sure that living and working conditions are appropriate, that perhaps living wages are being paid and trade unions being recognised, all the things that we would expect good companies to be doing. But unless they're also paying attention to how workers are being recruited, then very often through the payment of recruitment fees, the exploitation has happened before that worker even arrives at their work site.
And what would you say is an appropriate business response to this problem of migrant workers coming, effectively turning up to work, owing these great amounts of money at high rates of interest? What can business do about this problem?
What business needs to do is step up to its responsibility to pay those recruitment charges. There is a cost to recruitment, but it shouldn't be borne by the worker. It's definitely a business cost that should be paid by the employer. You and I wouldn't pay for a job or expect to pay, and it's not right that blue-collar workers, primarily in the global south, are paying enormous fees which bear no relationship to the actual cost of delivering those services anyway. So the thing that business should do is adopt the employer pays principle, whereby they commit to paying the full costs of recruitment for workers. That way they will ensure an efficient and decent supply chain of workers, and also make sure that they're preventing exploitation of those workers through recruitment fees in their supply chain.
Neill Wilkins, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks very much, bye.